We'll get it tomorrow.
I'll go tomorrow, yeah.
Yeah, but
Hello.
Harold, you're on silent.
Huh?
What's going to be Shabbos? Am I still silent?
No, we hear you.
Okay. Yeah, what's going to be Shabbos? You guys having Shul Shabbos?
No, we're having children.
It's better than Shul. Where are we holding? I forgot where the last page was.
Page 172.
I can smell the challah from here.
Let's see if you have the powder on your fingers.
I see you have dough. Bernie, you have dough.
That's a better line. What happened to Gerard?
Don't know. I should call and find out.
Text him.
Jeff, should I go in the other room?
No, did you mind if it's on without a sound?
No, but you don't hear the sound.
Restart.
Hello, everybody.
Evening.
Hello.
$173. Which type of dough is obligated in Hafrashas Challah? Is that correct? Okay.
I thought it was before that, but it's okay.
Was it 172?
Yeah, that's the one. 173.
173. Okay, that's what I thought we left off.
Okay.
So which type of dough is obligated in Hafrashas Challah? Another factor that affects when the obligation of Hafrashas Challah applies relates to the type and thickness of the dough. Does the mitzvah only apply to regular thick dough or also to thinner dough with more liquid inside? Think about pancake batter. In addition, must the dough be baked or would dough that is boiled on the fire, like when you make a bagel or make a donut, also be subject to Hafrashas Challah? These questions are addressed by the Gemara in Pesachim. Torah Hasuf ganim, they translate as sponge-like cakes. The haduvshanim, honey cakes. The iskaritin, spiced cakes. The chalas hamaseres, pan-fried bread. The hameduma, benduma is bread made from a mixture of regular chulin and truma. In all these cases, p'turim min hachala. Amreish Lakish, halalu maise ilfis hein. The reason why there's no challah is because these things are not baked, they're pot boiled. So since it's prepared in a pot and not in an oven, it's boiled rather than baked. However, Rav Yochanan Omer, no, maise ilfis also chayav. Rav Yochanan is of the opinion that even a boiled dough would be chayiv in challah. The reason these are exempt because halalu sha'ason b'chama. They were left out in the sun. They were baked in the sun. According to Reish Lakish, therefore, all grains that are boiled and not baked are not subject to challah, since they are not similar to regular grains that are baked. However, Rabbi Yochanan holds that even if they are boiled in a pot on the fire, they must have challah taken. Shulchan Aruch rules with
What bracha you make though? You make a motzi, or
you make a motzi.
even though you're not subject to.
Elazar, when you eat a bagel, it's boiled. It's not
Right.
baked. You make a
But
motzi.
what about a donut though? A donut's the same way, made the same way.
No, it's not.
Boiled.
No, but it's like pas sabab b'kismin. It's made with not even pas. It's a mizonos. It's not made with water. Donut. It's got fruit. It's got juices in it, or it's not just dough and water. I think it's fruit. It's what is it? Honey, or I don't know how to make donuts, but donuts are mizonos. They're not bread.
Right, but I'm saying because they're boiled. I think they're boiled too, no?
Or they're fried. I think donuts are fried in oil.
Fried, right, yeah.
But either way, it's not
Challah by bread.
but it's not bread
Mhm.
because of the way the dough of donuts are made, the way that the dough is made. Think about pizza. Pizza, only if you eat enough of it and you're koveh sud on it, but otherwise they say it's a mizonos. Even though, because obviously the dough is made it's not just water and flour, something else. Either they put oil in it or, right? So it exists. Bread has to be made just flour and water. Otherwise, if it's got fruit juices in it, that's why when you fly on a plane and they give you the bread that quote unquote is the mizonos bread, made with fruit juice. Now, even by that, if you eat enough of it, you should make hamotzi, like pizza. Okay. What's interesting is we've learned from this sugi in the Gemara, the two shitas of Reish Lakish and Rav Yochanan, and the Shulchan Aruch rules with the Rav Yochanan, but adds based on Tosfos that the obligation of taking challah applies only if liquid was not used in the boiling process. If liquid was used, the dough would not be subject to afrashas challah. So isa shevlilasa raka, a very thin dough, and was baked in an oven or a pan. Bein sheitiach v'achakach hidbik, whether it was heated and then attached to the wall, or bein shehidbik v'achakach hitiach, or whether it was attached to the wall, like when you make a pita, and then got heated chayav is b'chalav uvad shlo al yidei mashke. But if you add fluid to that process, then even based on that Tosfos, it would not require challah. Now, we're going to summarize at the end of at least this shiur, all of the, like we'll make a chart and we'll figure out what requires challah, what doesn't. So let's focus on how the Gemara above affects the category of dough known as belila ava, thick batter, which is the standard type of dough used for making bread. And then we will return to discussing belila raka, which is a thin batter. So based on this dispute between Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish, what should be the halacha concerning a belila ava, meaning a thick batter, that is boiled rather than baked? Would Reish Lakish still say that the dough is not subject to afrashas challah? So Rabbeinu Tam suggests that the entire dispute between Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish, whether grain boiled in a pot is considered like baking or not, applies only to a belila raka, a thin batter, such as thin cake batter or pancake batter. But concerning a belila ava, a thick dough, one must separate challah even what is boiled or deep fried, according to all. His reasoning is that the obligation of a fresh challah takes effect at the time of kneading, gilgul isa. So as long as the dough is solid at that time, it's obligated in challah. Where's the Rabbeinu Tam? It's in Tosfos Psachim Lamed Zayin. Omer Rabbeinu Tam, the dafka b'blilaso raka, only by a thin belila. Spligid Rav Yochanan, Sover Rav Yosef b'ilfus osei alecha v'chai v'chala. It's only there where Rav Yochanan says that if you bake it, even though it's a thin dough, you would be chayv and challah. Reish Lakish Sover eino osei alecha. That still doesn't make it bread. Upater. Ava blilaso ava, but with a thick batter, kula alma moida de chayv b'chala. Everybody agrees that it's chayv and challah. Fila yedei mashke. Even if you added liquid, the chiv challah have mishaz gilgul when you make the dough, like it's proven in many places. If you started with spongy dough and spongy cake, then Tzurba M'Rabanan. But chilasa sufganim v'sofo isa, if the beginning was spongy, but later on it became thick, or chilasa isa v'sofo sufganim chayeves b'chalav v'nu Rabbeinu Tam da'achinami mevarach lavamotzi, this would be bread as well. In contrast to the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam, the Torah cites the opinion of any other Rishonim that holds that if one intends to cook or fry the dough, one is not obligated in Afrashas Challah, even if the batter is thick. Reb Shimon Kosav, the filo oisa isa gemura, you make a really thick dough, but in daito labasha, if you're going to bake it, boil it, or latagno, you're going to fry it ptura, you will not be chayav challah. Aval in bishla v'lohaya b'daito l'bishla, but let's say that was not his intent. Ela losha stam, he needed it because he didn't know what he was going to do with it. V'achakach nimlach, he changed his mind levashel, then chayeves. V'kach kasav Rambam. Shakol holech achar das ha'odam, goes after the intent of the person. Ketzad ha'oses isa v'tchilos v'sofal das u'gorim. Let's say a person was making this spongy cake, and that was his thought process beginning and after Ptura. But galgala al das isa v'nimlach lasos of gorim. He initially was going to make it bread. He changed his mind. That would be chayiv and chalash. It's chayiv mishas gilgul. It's chayiv once he makes the dough. Gilgal al dasu gonim, and if you've made the dough because you were going to make sponge cake, v'nimlach shalolaso sugonim el isa, then you change your mind. You want to make bread, also chayetas. V'chein maskonas avi arosh zal, right? Because the father Yaakov ben Atur, Yaakov ben Arosh is the author of the Tur. So that was Rosh was his father. The Shulchan Aruch rules in accordance with the majority opinion that one need not separate challah even for a blila ava, means even if you have a thick dough, even if one intends to cook or fry it. It says in Yoredeya, isa shablilaso ava, it's a thick dough, the gilglak al das lavashal tagna, but your mind, your intent is to bake it, is to boil it or fry it. Or laso sufganim or leaf shabacham, you're gonna make a sponge cake, or you're going to leave it in the sun. These are p'turim mechal. But if your intent was to make bread, and then you change your mind, because the chiyuv starts when you make the dough. If you change your mind, chayeves. So basically, the Shulchan Aruch follows the Tur. But if your intent, even with a thick dough, is to cook or fry it, it would be potter. The Shach writes that one needs to take into account the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam. Therefore, he writes that if one makes a blila ava with intent to cook or fry it, one separates challah but doesn't make a bracha. But in the other mandarim said you make a bracha. But Rabbeinu, the Shach says not to. That means many poskim hold that even if you have a thick dough, and even if your intent was to boil it, it's still chayiv because when you were making the dough, it was already chayiv, like it says in the Beis Yosef. So you have two choices. Separate the challah, but don't make a bracha. Or actually bake some of the dough. They can't just chayiv kula b'kala. The Yalkut Yosef, right, the son of Ravadia, follows the same approach. The real chiyuv is dough that's ready to be baked. You have dough that is thick, but you're going to fry it in oil. Like donuts, the chadome, or you're going to boil it, itriot, like noodles, like pasta, right? Because pasta starts off as a dough, right? You make the dough, You
Sure.
thin it out, cut it. So mikra din ptura mafrashas challah. Those are potter from challah. Ulam yeshoimim shemachar v'isa zubli loso ava. But since when you start off making dough for donuts or dough for spaghetti, it's a thick dough, so we are concerned about the shach. So arei chayvus mafrashas challah, but ken yesh lahachmir lafish challah miisa zu below bracha. So some have a minhag to separate challah, but not to make a bracha. Now, let's say you take a piece of that dough and you put it in the oven and bake it, even though 95% of it you're gonna boil or fry. So there, when you separate the challah because of the worry of the shach, because when you start off with a thick batter, and at that point there's a sort of a chiyuv challah on it. That way you separate challah and you make a bracha by baking some of that dough. And that's what the Sefer HaKasher says. To summarize, would seem that the halacha is as follows: dough that consists of a blila ava, right? If it's a thick dough, should have challah separated with a bracha if you're going to use it for baking. Without a bracha, if you're going to boil it in water or fry it in oil. So you're going to make the dough and make pasta out of it, or you're going to make the dough and make donuts out of it by frying it in oil. You still separate challah, but no bracha. That's the ruling of Sefer HaKashrus, that one should separate challah without a bracha for a be'ila ava, thick dough, if one is using it to prepare food such as noodles, which are boiled with water. Right? Kishibulas, ava kagon itrios, pasta, macaroni, malawach. Malawach, I think, is that Yemenite,
Right.
some kind of Yemenite, like a pita.
Very thin.
The sufgani yod, yeah, but Sydney, the dough starts off thick.
But the malawach, they make very thin. They pour it very thin. Maybe, yeah, the dough and the,
But you, it's
like
a
pancake
Yemenite
dough.
dish consisting of a pancake-like dough that is popular in many Israel, but you boil it. That's the thing. But since you start off with a thick dough, he says you should separate yirei shamayim yafrish mimenu lelo bracha. So this puts this halacha into action. We see a ramification. Now it gets more interesting because now we're going to deal with blila raka, thin batter. Like I think pancakes is a good example, or if you can make crepes, lintzes. I mean, I don't know how many people make this at home, but certainly you see, if you ever been to the farmer's market and nobody eats from there, but you see what they do there. They have that thin batter and they put it on that metal round thing and they make some kind of, what is that called? And you put chocolate in it. What is that? No, but there's a word for that. It's
Griddle.
Suzette?
crepes.
Crepes.
Well, crepes. So it's a thin. That's
Palichinton. Say it correctly.
Magda makes crepes, right?
Magda makes palichinton.
Oh, shit. Okay. We'll now turn our attention more closely to the status of a blila raka, thin batter. We already saw above that the Shulchan Aruch holds that a blila raka that was baked or boiled without liquid would still be obligated in challah. But the Shulchan Aruch later in the same simon seems to rule that thin batter is exempt. Right? Trita, dainu isa shablilasa raka, thin dough, and you pour it on a stovetop. Sounds to me like a pancake or a crepe. And then it spreads. The nefis is baked. Ptura would not be chayiv challah. So how come one Shulchan Aruch seems to say it's chayiv and another one seems to say it's potter? A number of resolutions to this stira offered by the Achronim to this contradiction. Some distinguish between whether the dough thickens shortly after it's baked or takes much longer to thicken. Others differentiate between whether the cake has a certain thickness after being baked or remains thin. The Yalkut Yosef brings both of these explanations in clarifying the halacha. Isa sheblilasa raka. You have a thin batter. Udlila v'nozeles. It's liquid. Kigon isa miyuedes lafias hablinses, dough that is being made to make blinses. V'halachuach. Lachuach is a spongy pancake-like bread that originated in Yemen, Somalia, and Djibouti. When they pour this dough, l'tocha machvas, into the frying pan, l'lo mashke, they don't put any fluid there. He mispashetet v'nafe, it spreads and bakes. Yesh omrim shechovas hafresh challah mimena. Some say that whether you're required to be mafresh challah, talui, is dependent be'ovi hamiskabel la'achra afiyasa. How thick is it after you bake it? If it's very thin, kigona blinces. V'chein habatzel habotzek shel hoifel, like wafers, or v'halachuach. Ptura mafreshus challah. You would not have to give challah for that. However, imamafe, if the resulting baked good that is made, fu'ava ke 8 millimeters, so it's 0.8 centimeters, right? 8 millimeters thick. That would be chayiv. You do it not when it's in the dough stage. You do it after you baked it. You cover them all with a cloth, or you put them all in one basket. We, of course, as long as they contain the measurement of dough that is required for halachic challah, which we're going to hopefully learn that tonight. What is that measurement? And then you give challah and you make a brach. However, yesh omrim she'adavar tolui im ha'isa blilosa raka v'inozelas kamayim. So if it's very thin and pours like water, and the shofchino sama machbas cham, if you pour it on a hot frying pan, umiyad he mishpatetis v'nefes, and it spreads and bakes. P'turim ha'farshas challah, gonna blinces. Shezman ha'fiyasa l'machbas hu 30 shiniyot, like takes 30 minutes to bake them. Avalim lochim isad lilazuf. You take this very liquid dough, batter, v'ofinota b'tanur ala machbat. You bake it in an oven or a pan. Umafez zeh zakuk lizman ha'fiyah. And it takes, I think shniyot is 30 seconds. I'm sorry.
Seconds.
So 30 seconds to make it. So that's ptura. But if it takes a long time to bake, it doesn't bake right away. So then it would be chayiv. You could go an ugot tort, like a tort cake. He says it's a type of layer cake that is filled mostly with cream or other filling as well as thin layers of flour, popular in Europe and Israel. Again, you separate the challah not in the dough stage, but afterwards. If this lachuach is very thin, and it bakes right away, so then it'll be like the blintz. So it all depends on how quick if it takes a while to bake, then you treat it like bread. Otherwise, it's potter. Yalkut Yosef continues. Chazine medivrei moran. Well, a tortilla is made out of corn. That's not a grain. Okay, but you make your own flour. You don't make your tortillas from scratch, right? So then the dough you bought. Hopefully you bought. It has
Flour and water. You mean,
no, I'm talking. Susie's asked me about the flour tortilla.
the ready-made?
Yeah, but if you bought it with a hechsher, they must have taken challah when they made it. Well, when you buy it, it's fully. You don't have to cook it again, do you? You can eat it raw, correct? It's not raw; it's been baked. So the company did it. It's flour and water. Now, again, if that is made in seconds and it's very thin batter, so that would fall under this p'tur of challah. So that's based on this machlokas. If it takes a while to bake that, And if the dough is thick, then it would require challah. But you don't have to give the challah. You're buying, it's like you're buying bread from a market.
You haven't mentioned matzah, have you?
Matzah, you have to get, matzah's bread.
But what's the thickness? They're always talking about the thickness.
No, but this is talk, we're now in the sugya of a thin batter.
Okay,
If you start off with a thick batter, a thick dough, and matzah started with a thick dough, we said if you bake it, remember, matzah is bread.
okay.
So whether you bake bread or whether you bake matzah, that would
So,
require.
but do you roll it out thin? Okay, you roll it out thin.
Roll it out
Okay,
thin,
gotcha.
But that doesn't make it how you roll it. Remember, the only heter there was if it started off thick, but you boiled it or fried it.
Uh-huh.
We said you do take challah, but you don't make a bracha.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so like matzah balls, for example, that's a much thinner.
But matzah
So
ball,
it's,
you cooked
isn't it the same concept?
You remember we said you cooked it.
Oh, yeah, but so you put in what, right? Right.
So that was like we said the pasta. But again, the question is what kind of dough is matzah ball? Is it liquid? Is it thin dough or thick dough? It's thin. Matzah ball. You wouldn't call that a thick dough.
Thin dough.
It's a thin dough. So now you're in this blila raka sugya. So there clearly by boiling it, you would not be chayav and challah. There we said it's only if you intend to bake it. I think we got a better understanding today of the geder here. We're not through. The Sefer Kashrus notes that there's another distinction as well concerning blila raka. If the blila raka is intended to be used for frying or boiling with liquid, meaning the thin dough, it's exempt. While if it's intended to be used for baking, where afrasha must be performed with sufficient thickness, it is obligated in afrasha. But a matzah ball, you're not intending to bake that, you're intending to boil it. So isa, a dough, shablilasa raka, that's a thin dough. Oh no, it's liquidy. The omedes latigon or labishul, and it's, what are you going to do with it? You're going to fry it or cook it. You're going to make pancakes. Ptura mafresh challah. You don't have to give challah on that. It's a liquid batter. You're not baking it. You're frying it or you're boiling it. Onam kasher isa kazu nefes betanur. But if you bake it in an oven, and you make this tort, some say, like we learned before, that you have to be mafresh challah afterwards. Now, the Sefer Mishpatei Eretz comments that in cases where a fresh challah is performed for a blila raka that is baked, it should be done after the food is baked, as the obligation does not take effect until that time. You don't be mafresh challah when it's a liquid. You do it after baking him. You did it, you got to do it again. So they give us a nice chart to summarize the practical halacha. Dough that is blila raka is exempt from afrashas challah if it is extremely thin, though there's machlokas opinions as to how we define that. But if it's thick enough that when it gets baked in the oven, it will ultimately become solid. One should separate challah with a bracha if the amount of flour used qualifies for the minimum shear, which we will learn what that shear is in the next section. But it should be done after it becomes hard. If one plans to fry or cook it with this blila raka, most opinions hold that it's exempt, even if it's not extremely thin, since the obligation takes effect only when it is baked. And below is a chart that summarizes the difference. So we learned, blila ava, it's a thick dough. If you bake it, you got to separate with a bracha. That's clear. And then we saw that if you fry or boil a blila ava, it's a machlokes. And we hold to separate without bracha. And the blila raka, if it's fried or boiled, it's patur. But if it's baked, separate with a bracha, only if it's thick enough and only if you have enough material that it would chayav challah, and only after you baked it. Now, page 180. Susie. The minimum amount of flour required. One of the most common questions that arises concerning the mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah is, what is the minimum amount of flour that must be used in order to be obligated in the mitzvah? According to the Gemara Ne'eruvin, one must use slightly more than 5 quarter kav. That means 5 over 4 kav, 1 1/4 kav of flour. Where do we see that? Tan Rabbanan. Reishis arisosechem. Kedei isosechem. I mean, the way you make your dough. How much is that? Kedei isas amidbar. Like the isa that was made in the desert. Kama isas amidbar. T'chsiv v'haomer asiris ha'efa hi. Now, an ephah is a measurement, which is 3 saw, which were 18 kav or 72 log. Now, an omer was 1/10 of this. So, shiva revoim kemach, ikan amru, shiva revoim kemach va'od. That you need 7/4 of a kav of a flour more. So you need like a kav and 3/4 of flour. 7/4. Shein shisha shel Yerushalmis. Now remember, when they came to Yerushalayim, the measurement changed of kav. Shein chamisha shel tzipori. That's the 5/4 kav of the tzipori. Because the measurements of what a kav was changed a number of times. So Rashi there notes that 1 log is equivalent to 6 eggs. So the measurement of the omer equaled 43.2 eggs. I guess if you do, right? Right? 1 log, 6 eggs, 43 eggs. Rashi says, ha'efa shalosh sa'in, right? An ephah was 3 saw, va'asah vav kavin, a saw is 5 kavs, va'kav dalad lugin, right? So a kav is 4 lug. So since 1 lug is 6 eggs, that's how they got 43.2 eggs, because you need 5/4 kav. Nimtzas asir sa'efa, mem gimel beitzim, 43 v'chomesh, 43 1/5 beitzim, u'shir l'chala u'lemenachos. That's the shir. Baruch Adonai Shakon Yibro. The Shulchan Aruch rules based on the Gemara that this indeed is the minimum measurement of flour necessary for the obligation of Rosh Hashanah. The Shulchan Aruch then explains how to assess that amount practically, converts those measurements to those used as in his time, the dram. The Ramah offers a different method. It involves measuring through a utensil. It says the Shulchan Aruch, Yoredei Shin Chav Daled, Ein Chayav El Chameshes Revoim. You're only chayav chal if you have 5/4 kav. Umida shemachzik arboim v'sholosh beitzim v'chomish beitza. That's the measurement that holds 43 1/5 egg. Mamal also kemach. That has to be the how much flour you have. V'oso kemach u'shir chala. If you start off with that much dough, you've met the minimum requirement. Uchshomal amida kemach. If you fill the utensil up with flour, you have to smooth it out on top, v'lo gedusha, not heaped up. Umishkal 5 revoim kemach u'chamesh me'ot v'tzrim dram. In the Shulchan Aruch's time, it was 520 drams. Mikemach pitin sheb'Mitzrayim. Remember, this Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Karo lived in Tzfat. I don't know how much wheat was grown in Eretz Yisrael, but Egypt was a source of wheat. So maybe they bought their wheat, it was Egyptian wheat that they bought. What does the Ramah say? Kliya machzik eser etzbos aleser etzbos. He said you take a kli that measures 10 fingers by 10 fingers. According to Rav Chaim Nat, that's 2 centimeters. Well, according to the Chazon Ish, it's 2.4 centimeters. So according to the Chazon Ish, You're talking about a utensil that was 24 by 24 centimeters. That's length and width, like it's like a square. That was 3 1/9 of a finger deep, which would be about 7 centimeters deep. That's the, Ramah didn't give us a weight. He gave us the size of a kli. Right? Matzlik Esra Tzbos, Let's Tzbos, Perum Sholosh Tzbos, Uchi said Tzbos Bekara. That's the Shir Chala. V'chein mida sheyesh bo sheva etzbos, pachal shtei teshios etzbo, al sheva pachal shtei teshios etzbo, Perum sheva etzbos, pachal shtei teshios etzbo, hua oimer. V'chol etzbos elu, heim rochav godel shel yad. He says it's the width of the thumb, not the width of any other finger. So contemporary poskim dispute which of these methods to use in applying the sources to our measurements, like kilograms or pounds. Moreover, poskim dispute the minimum of flour needed without other ingredients for farshas challah, both concerning separating challah without reciting a bracha, which is the amount for which there's a suffix, and for separating challah with a bracha, which is definitely obligated in halacha. There are a number of different factors that make the issue more complex. A, there are different calculations as to the precise measurement of the dram, which was used commonly in the Middle East for centuries. For those who use the size of eggs to determine the size, there are different calculations as to the proper size of eggs today, and whether they've gotten smaller based on the fact that their size does not equal the measurement of the figures mentioned, similar to the question of double shiurim and the size of matzah. It's also unclear how compressed the flour must be when measuring its weight or volume. So the following chart details many of the opinions for regular white flour. Measurement is generally by volume, but we're giving it by weight here because it's the equivalent. So Rav Yechiel Mechel Tuchatinsky.
No, why is it equivalent?
Say again?
Volume and weight are not equivalent. It all depends on density.
Okay, well, but we know what the density of flour is. We're talking about the
Well,
same.
we just learned about thin batter and thick batters. A thick batter.
Remember, we're starting off with the white flour. You measure the white flour. So we know what the density of the white flour is.
You measure the white flour before the water goes into it.
Yes.
So these measurements are for the amount of flour, not the amount of water or other liquids.
This measurement is the dry weight of the flour.
Ah, okay.
So Rav Yechiel Mechel Tuchachinsky. So first of all, you should know who that is. He's the author of the Gesher HaChaim. The Gesher HaChaim is the definitive sefer on Avelus. Rav Mechel Tuchachinsky lived in Israel and in the early 1900s and was a major posek. So he held that if you have 1 kilogram or 2.3.
He also wrote the definitive sefer on the timeline,
on
the
the
international timeline. And
Right.
he also had a son who was the guy, I think, from the farm store. He had a very famous son too.
Which farm store?
What's that famous farm store?
No,
You
not
know,
Ben Arza.
Ben Arza, I think, is his son.
No way. Ben Arza, Chaim Ben Arza ate in my house.
Okay, he wasn't his son? Not possible?
Oh my God. Really?
I think so. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. If you don't know, then I'm not sure.
Listen, Ben Arza was the first bookstore. Remember in
Chanoch Ben Arza.
he passed. You're wrong. He was the son-in-law of Eliyahu Kitov.
Oh, that's might be right. You're right.
He was, and he met him at Young Israel. He gave shiurim. I hosted him in my home.
Right. You're right.
He passed away very young. You know, he passed away.
Yeah, I know, of course.
But he has children. They're involved in editorship. I just saw one of the Ben Arzas is part of the editor, I think maybe of the Steinsaltz Institute. You know, he edits the Nevi'im and the So the kid stayed in publishing, but he was Rav Eliyahu Kitov's son-in-law. He introduced me to the Sefer Aparshios that Rav Eliyahu Kitov wrote.
He wrote,
He
sure.
come and give shiurim at Young Israel on that. You know which book I'm talking about? It's a 10-volume Sefer Aparshios, one of the best things on Chumash.
I bought it, was in a pamphlet. It used to come out at a parsha at a time.
Correct. Then eventually it got published, and you could get it
Right.
from Arza. If Chaim Eisenberg, do you have Sefer Aparshios by Eliyahu Kitov? You need that is a fantastic thing. I remember when I got turned on to that, it opened my eyes in Chumash. You know Eliyahu Kitov from Sefer Toda'ah, from the Book of Our Heritage.
Yeah, the Sefer Todah I have.
Okay, so there's something called Sefer Aparshios. You'll have tremendous enjoyment. By the way, I was in 6th grade in Hillel, and Eliyahu Kitov visited Hillel. I remember Rabbi Gottesman bringing him into the class. He came to Los Angeles, Eliyahu Kitov. Sidney, Rav Yechiel Mechel Tuchatinsky was in the Haredi world. He's one of the major, like, by Rav Salant and Rav Diskin. That was his circle. Of course, he knew Rav Kook. So you need 1 kilogram, 2.31 pounds. That's to separate, but without a bracha. To make a bracha, you need 1.57 kilograms, 3.46 pounds. Chazon Ish, you can see he had a different shita. According to Rav Chaim Naef, 3.6 pounds. Rav Ovadia Yosef, 3.4 pounds. Mordechai Eliyahu, 5.9. Look at Rav Herschel Sechter, 5 pounds. So that gives you, that's the biggest shear, right?
No,
Yeah.
where Mordechai Eliyahu has
yeah.
5.5.
Although one does not always use enough flour so as to be obligated in the mitzvah of Farshas Challah, the Gemara Pesachim cautions that one is not allowed to intentionally use less than the requisite amount of flour so as not to be subject to the mitzvah. So you shouldn't be careful, I'm going to measure less. No, you should measure, and in fact, people do just the opposite. They dafka make a lot of flour to be chayiv challah. Or Rav Yosef, Hani Nashi Didon, our women, nog lemepa kfeza kfeza lepischa. They will make 3/4 of a lug at a time, since it's easier to, it doesn't become chametz as easy if you have a smaller dough. Amalei Abai, my daitich lechumra. I mean, what are you doing this? Chumra de kulu de komafkila mechala. You're telling them to do that, but it's going to take them out of it's better for them to make a big dough, be chayiv and challah, and they shouldn't worry about it. And that rule is codified in the Shulchan Aruch. You shouldn't intentionally make less amount of dough to avoid chiyuv challah. But one who does not have enough flour to use for the minimum shear, or does not need so much flour, is permitted to prepare less than the minimum amount. You're not obligated. It's just you shouldn't be cognizant of the fact, I'm going to reduce it because of this. You don't need to make it. You don't have to according to the Aruch HaShulchan. You say you're preparing challah for Shabbat. You don't have a lot of guests. You can bake challah and make less. Meaning, if you need to make a big, you're going to have a lot of guests. So you've calculated, I need 5/4 kav flour to make the amount of bread I need. So in that case, you shouldn't divide it up into 2 sections to avoid challah. No, make the big dough and give challah. But if you don't need that big amount of challah, you're not required to make a big dough. So to summarize, there are 5 conditions necessary for the mitzvah of Farshas Challah. 1, the dough must be from the 5 species of grain. 2, the dough is mixed with one of the 7 liquids, otherwise one would separate without a bracha. 3, the dough is intended to be baked in the oven or on the stove without liquid. 4, the batter is not excessively thin and will harden during the baking. So if it doesn't harden or if it's too thin, there's no challah. The amount of flour used is more than a minimum measurement. Okay. And you can read on page 186 further details into the sugya we learned tonight. Let's continue, page 193. Who are the people who have the chiyuv to separate the challah? In the previous shir, we began studying the halachos of hafrashas challah by discussing issues such as the basis for observing the halacha today, the conditions necessary to render the dough subject to the obligation of challah. In this year, we will separate many aspects of the actual process of the hafrasha, including who performs it, how much to separate, and what to do with the dough afterwards. We learned in the previous year that the mitzvah of challah is mandated any time that the dough is kneaded in accordance with the guidelines outlined by the halacha. Nevertheless, the mitzvah is traditionally and deeply associated with women. Specifically, the Talmud Yerushalmi offers one explanation for why women should ideally perform the mitzvah. Adam Arishon challah tahara la'olam hayah. Adam is like the pure challah of the world. The chsiv, vayitzer Hashem Elokim es Adam afar mina adama. God made Adam out of the dust of the ground. Demar Amrav Yosef bar Ktsar Kivan Sha'isha miskaskeses itzasu b'mayim. When a woman takes the flour and stirs it with water, he madbes chalasa, and she then separates challah. The point is, just as the Pnei Moshe says, just as a woman needs flour with water and then separates challah, so too God created Adam from dirt immediately after watering the ground, which is recorded in the previous pasuk. So Adam was like a challah, the first product of the ground after being watered. Very interesting. The Garmalu Chava Misa. It was Chava, right, who gave the Adam the apple to eat, or whatever the fruit was to eat, which led to them, they were living eternally, but one of the punishments that they got is now they were going to die. So in a sense, Chava caused death. Lefichach masru mitzvahs challah leisha. So the mitzvah of challah was given to her. See also the Or Zarua, who cites this passage and concludes that the mitzvah is traditionally associated with women. Another reason given for the connection between women and freshas challah is that women are often the ones more involved in food preparation and housework. According to the second reason, perhaps one could argue a man who performs more of the food preparation and housework than his wife would take precedence in performing the mitzvah, while according to the reason of Yerushalmi, the wife would still be given preference. Sounds like there's a little bit of a kapara that's going on. The fact that women are generally preferred as the performers of this mitzvah notwithstanding, the Ben Ish Chai comments that it is still fitting for a man to perform hafrashas challah once a year. Isn't that interesting? It says, V'yasa zo sa'ish ba'atzmo ba'aser simei tshuva l'kayim pamachas hafrashas challah biyado udvar bi'ito ma'tov la'osif schus al schiyos of kodem Yom Kippur, to give him more schus before Yom Kippur. Did anybody ever do that? Anybody have that minhag?
It's the first I've heard of it.
Right? Well, Ben Ish Chai is a Sephardi, so maybe the Sephardim have that minhag.
Well, that's why I didn't hear about it.
Right?
But I'm sure in bakeries, the bakers must do it. No?
Yeah, but here the Ben Ish Chai lived in Baghdad, like
Oh,
in the 1800s.
Well, I wonder if since they say that your yotze preparation for Shabbos by buying challah baked for Shabbos. So maybe in the same way that during Aseret Tzemei Tshuva, because you buy Pas Yisrael during Aseret Tzemei Tshuva, it ensures that you're, somehow participating in hafrashas challah.
Could be. Can the owner of the dough authorize someone else to separate challah for him or her? As with other areas of halacha, one may indeed appoint a shaliach to separate challah in one's place. However, if someone separates challah from a mass of dough without the knowledge of its owner, the separation does not take effect. Ein mafrishin challah below rishus balaisa. A stranger can't come along and separate challah without the owner knowing. Says the Ramah, Shnei shutafim ein tzrichin litol reshus zeh mizeh. Two partners own a dough. One does not have to take. One doesn't have to get reshus from the other partner. Aval acher tzarich litol reshus mishneim. But if a third party comes along, he has to, and he wants to take challah from that dough, he has to get permission from both. Umihu, if not reshus la'acher la'afresh, if a person gave permission to another person to be mafresh, afilu ba'odo kemach, moil. Even if it's still flour, it works. Aval b'shadayin lo nischayev, even if it didn't become separate, even if there's no obligation to separate until you actually make the dough. The rule, though, does not limit a woman's ability to separate challah without her husband's awareness. Since with regard to this mitzvah, she has the status of the true owner of the dough. Consequently, the Or Zarua and the Trumas Sadeshan rule that a woman has the ability to appoint another to separate the challah for her. Right? The Mishpatei Eretz there discusses the inverse question of whether a husband may appoint a shaliach to separate challah without his wife's consent, since it's primarily her mitzvah. With regard to this, the Or Zarua suggests that perhaps he may not do so, while the Aruch HaShulchan rules that he may. So it's machlokas Or Zarua and Aruch HaShulchan, whether a husband can do it without asking his wife's permission. Very interesting. The poskim debate if a domestic employee, and we're not talking about a Gentile, that's clearly not permitted. But let's say you have a Jewish domestic employee or any other third party may assume license to separate challah even without being formally appointed to do so, if there's some concern that the dough will be ruined if it's not baked immediately. The Ramah adopts the position of Trumas Hadeshen, according to whom the person may separate the challah, due to the principle of Zachin Adam Shalom B'fanav. One may benefit another in his absence. I find a lottery ticket with Harold Katz's name on it, and I'm afraid that it's going to get lost. I can pick it up and I can be kona it on behalf of Harold. And Harold owns it from the moment I picked it up. And there could be a nafkamina in halacha based on that timing. So I can be kona because I can be, now, let's say there's an IOU signed by Harold that says Harold owes somebody $10,000. And I can't pick that up and be zoicha for him because that's a chav for him. That's a liability for him if I find that or pick it up. So I can't be chav la'adam shelo b'fanav, but I can be zoicha la'adam shelo b'fanav. And the halacha here seems to be suggesting that since this dough is going to get ruined and this third party is there, and he says, you know what, I'm going to be, and we got to bake this dough right away, but I know challah wasn't given, so he's going to separate the challah on behalf of the person. So that's considered a chus for the person. So based on that, it works. The third party can thus become that person's agent for performing formal tasks, as in this case, it is to the owner's benefit that the dough is properly separated. Im yadinan deschusu lebala isa. The Ramah says if it's known very clearly that it's going to be a merit and a benefit to the owner of the dough, the dough is getting ruined, mutter litol challah below reshuso. Then the third party can take challah without the reshus. Why? The zachalodam shelo b'fanav, like we explained. V'chein misharesa shababayis, a Jewish domestic servant that worked in the house. Yichol litol challah below reshuso could also take the challah. Let's say this domestic makes challah every week with the balabusta, and she has given her permission in the past to separate the challah. So certainly in that situation, the Ramah is saying that even if the owner is not there, she'd be able to do it. However, the K'tzos HaChoshen, so we are learning Yoredeya. Another major volume of Shulchan Aruch that hopefully we'll get to is Choshen Mishpat. Well, the two major commentaries on Choshen Mishpat are the Nesivos HaMishpat, so the Nesivos, and the K'tzos. And that's called the K'tzos HaChoshen, but referred to as the K'tzos. So the K'tzos HaChoshen He lived 1700, late 1700s, early 1800s, I believe, or maybe even earlier. The Tzurba M'Rabanan takes the opposing position and rules that the other party may not separate challah without authorization from the primary party. In his view, the principle of Zachin L'Adam B'Shalom B'Fanav only applies to giving something to another person, but not to taking away something from another, which might be described as taking. Zachin Mi Adam, even if that act of removing is ultimately constructive action. In this instance of removing challah would be mandated only with the knowledge and approval of the owner of the dough. Kosav Tzurba M'Rabanan Simin Kuf Peiches V'zulu Shono Isha Bala Sabayis, a woman La Shalom Misharesa Shala Isa. The domestic servant was kneading dough, and the owner had walked away before giving challah. And before the dough had risen, and that thus if it would have remained any longer, the dough would get ruined. And now this domestic helper wants to separate challah before the dough is ruined. The question was asked to the Tzurba M'Rabanan, is it permitted or not? Tshuva. So Tzurba says it's okay. Given the miskalkel chusu lebalabais, because otherwise it's going to get ruined. So therefore it's a chus for the owner. For kaimelan zechia mitam shlichus israbe, that zechia is sort of part of shlichus. V'chanami here as well. A mishareses nasa shlucha. She in essence becomes a shaliach of the employer, even without the employer's knowledge. Mitam chusula. There's only a worry that of contamination or destruction of the dough. The imkain behind the mishareses, the mefareshes challah mishal bal tzvai. So this servant who's being mafresh challah ain't bezeh mishum schus. So the Tzos is arguing with the Tzurba M'Rabanan, saying there's no schus. That's where the person who's being zoicha is actually taking something. I see something on the ground and I pick it up on behalf of my friend. Takes possession of a get. You're acting on behalf of somebody and to accept her get. The zocheisha beget of a mafresh mishalo. If you're separating meiser or some other kind of truma or something like this, that's you're helping the guy. This is it's not a schus, it's a convenience. That you need, the guy has to know about it. Levi doesn't understand just because it might get ruined. Why is this chus? You could always be mafresh challah after you bake it. So bake it and then be mafresh. So yeah, it's more of a mitzvah to do it when it's a dough. If the balabais is not there, the Tzos says it's better off do it after you bake it. From tiskalkela isha. Better if they think that the dough is going to get ruined, go ahead and bake it and then be mafresh afterwards. It's nice to learn a good piece of choice. We don't get to do that often. Okay, it's 9:00. Let's just remember we'll pick up on 190.